I'm back to talk about my July reading summaries. Making a guilty confession first, I wasn't reading the most diligently this month. I've been distracted by a lot of stuff. And so some of the books in this list are going to be unfinished. So apologies for being an irresponsible summary, and I will try to finish up the unfinished books next month. I do aim to read more in August, hopefully. I think it's probably not going to be true. But anyways, I shall first start with the books that I did complete. Here is Virginia Woolf's The Voyage Out. Basically, I briefly mentioned it in last month's video that I started it, and I said that I would report back this month, so here I am. Firstly, about style. Clearly in this book, Woolf hasn't reached her full-blown stream of consciousness. It's still very conventional Edwardian writing, and the narrative is chronological, and it's about middle-class subjects, middle-class society, social affairs, especially romance and courtship. And so we have the protagonist, Rachel Vinris. It's about her coming of age, entering into society as a young lady under the guardian of her aunt Helen, and the majority of the story takes place either on a ship or in an English hotel in a South American colony. So it's about the gradual awakening of two key aspects in Rachel's kind of worldview. So the first is the knowledge of how romantic relationships between men and women works, and this is facilitated by her encounter with two men. So one kind of very fleeting affair with Richard Dalloway. Yes, that is the Richard Dalloway that married Clarissa and later comes in Mrs. Dalloway. So Mrs. Dalloway is kind of this ongoing character in a lot of Woolf's works. And then the next is her engagement to a man called Terence Howard. And the second awareness she gains is knowledge of what she wants as an independent person, a sense of self-awareness that moves away from her kind of self-identification as an affiliative object of her father. So initially we see that she has a rather idealized view of the world. So she's very much into music, and she likes to see as expressive of feelings that are just really true and raw and sincere, and she could understand how people in society don't express themselves that way, and how in everyday life we deal with empty feelings or meaningless actions or words. And yes, this sort of lack of meaning behind a lot of the social action is a recurrent theme in Woolf's works. In this work, Woolf kind of conveys it at these 2 points. So here Rachel thinks, "It appeared that nobody ever said a thing they meant or ever talked of a feeling they felt, but that was what music was for, reality dwelling in what one saw and felt but did not talk about. One could accept a system in which things went round and round quite satisfactorily to other people, without often troubling to think about it, except as something superficially strange." And also she thinks, the lives of these people, she tried to explain, the aimlessness, the way they live, one goes from one to another and it's all the same, one never gets what one wants out of any of them. And in this work, although only in very brief moments, we can get a sense of what's a very dominant idea in all of Woolf's works, which is her very distinct way of examining the feeling of existing as a human, the standing back and throwing away of all conventional values and assumptions to look at the strangeness of life in its bare form. So here we have, "She was next overcome by the unspeakable queerness of the fact that she should be sitting in an armchair in the morning in the middle of the world. Who were the people moving in the house, moving things from one place to another, and life? What was that? It became stranger and stranger. She was overcome with awe that things should exist at all. She continued to be conscious of these vast masses of substances for a long stretch of time, the clock still ticking in the midst of the universal silence." And then when Rachel thinks about life in general, she kind of realizes that was the strange thing, that one did not know where one was going or what one wanted, and followed blindly, suffering so much in secret, always unprepared and amazed and knowing nothing. But one thing led to another, and by degrees something had formed itself out of nothing. And so one reached at last this calm, this quiet, this certainty, and it was this process that people called living. Perhaps then everyone really knew as she now where they were going, and things formed themselves into a pattern not only for her, but for them, and in that pattern lay satisfaction and meaning. So overall, regarding this work, I would say it's definitely not as experimentative as Woolf's later works, not as sharply revealing either, but it still carries pretty reasonable interest, and I think it's worth the read. So the next book is by Arthur Schopenhauer, and it's his collection of essays. The title one is On the Suffering of the World, and there are a lot of other ones. So I'll start with the first one. So the first essay, his aim is to kind of express to us the idea that suffering is the normality in life, and suffering is also what lies at the fundamental truth of living. And he wants to kind of remove the misconception of suffering as something that's negative in life. So he says this: For evil is precisely that which is positive, that which makes itself palpable, and good, on the other hand, i.e., all happiness and all gratification, is that which is negative, the mere abolition of a desire and extinction of a pain. And he also offers a theist perspective on how to treat suffering in life. So he says, as a reliable compass for orientating yourself in life, nothing is more useful than to accustom yourself to regarding this world as a place of atonement, a sort of penal colony. And then we have the next essay called On the Vanity of Existence. So he reveals some witty truths about how we often magnify like the holiness or grandeur of existence, attributing it with a lot of unnecessary meaning. Some of the key quotes here include, the greatest wisdom consists in enjoying the present and making this enjoyment the goal of life, because the present is all that is real and everything else merely imaginary. But you could just as well call this mode of life the greatest folly, for that which in a moment ceases to exist, which vanishes as completely as a dream, cannot be worth any serious effort. And then what I found really reasonable was this part where he writes, that human life must be some kind of mistake is sufficiently proved by the simple observation that man is a compound of needs which are hard to satisfy, that the satisfaction achieves nothing but a painless condition in which he is only given over to boredom, and that boredom is a direct proof that existence is in itself valueless, for boredom is nothing other than the sensation of the emptiness of existence. For his life, in the desire for which our essence and existence consist, possessed in itself a positive value and real content, there will be no such thing as boredom. Mere existence will fulfill and satisfy us. So yeah, that really answers a really big nagging question that I often have to really just ponder upon. Then in this collection there's some more essays which talk about his philosophical theories about the nature of essence, time, space, which became really confusing even for me. And there is this one essay called On Women, and that is very misogynistic. I was actually slightly triggered when I read it, and there are some very unfounded views that honestly some of them made me think they're more funny than aggravating, so I'm going to read some of that. Nature has provided her with superabundant beauty and charm for a few years at the expense of the whole remainder of her life, so that during these years she may so capture the imagination of a man that he is carried away into undertaking to support her honourably in some form or another for the rest of her life, a step he would seem hardly likely to take for purely rational considerations. And then in talking about the main difference between the two sexes, he says, the fundamental defect of the female character is a lack of sense of justice. This originates first and foremost in their want of rationality and capacity for reflection, but it is strengthened by the fact that, as the weaker sex, they are driven to rely not on force but on cunning, hence their instinctive subtlety and their ineradicable tendency to tell lies. I think one of the major bases that he's coming from in this quote is the idea that rationality is always more valuable. That's an enlightenment thing, but now we can cast some doubt on that. And then he has this essay called On Thinking for Yourself. So it basically aims to emphasize the importance of independent thinking, saying how people should not attain all their opinions from reading what others has written is always more valuable when it's arrived by yourself. So in a nutshell, his main argument here is much reading robs the mind of all elasticity as the continuous pressure of a weight does a spring, and that the surest way of never having any thoughts of your own is to pick up a book every time you have a free moment. I think it does speak some truth. Schopenhauer does not say that you should not read at all, but to not read too much and not just only read the opinions of others but don't think for yourself. And in a modern context, it could honestly apply to us, absorbing too much just news and social media feed without really leaving us time to reflect. And then there's this essay called On Aesthetics, and he talks about a lot of the views on arts and literature. There are a few that I found made a lot of sense. So one of them was, at the beginning of the play, we allow the dramatist carte blanche, while at this end we make certain definite demands of him. We demand that the outcome shall be a completely happy or completely tragic one, but it is not easy to make human affairs take so definite a direction. We then demand that this outcome shall be achieved naturally and fairly in an unforced way, and yet at the same time not to have been foreseen by the audience. So this is exactly why Schopenhauer thinks it's really hard to have a satisfactory ending compared to a beginning, because we really don't have much expectations for the beginning. And he also says, I think that is quite a truthful statement, the art lies in setting the inner life into the most violent motion with the smallest possible expenditure of outer life, for it is the inner life which is the real object of our interest. The task of the novelist is not to narrate great events but to make small ones interesting. Yeah, exactly. It's honestly so hard to make small events interesting, but that is what we want to see. Honestly, most readers don't want to see an apocalypse happening every single day. And then the last essay in this collection, called On Books and Writing, I do think he expresses some views which some people nowadays are going to think is rather elitist or politically incorrect, but I believe there is still at least some truth to it, whether we like it or not. So he says things like, Payment and reserved copyright are at the bottom of the ruin of literature. Only he who writes entirely for the sake of what he has to say writes anything worth writing. Every writer writes badly as soon as he starts writing for gain. The greatest works of the greatest men all belong to a time when they had to write them for nothing or for a very small payment. So I think it is true that when you don't write with the mind of like selling commercially to an audience and like that's how you measure success, the quality of your works tend to be better. But I think it's like rather unrealistic to demand that of everyone, because like we're not nobility nowadays. Like there are a lot back then, most people who wrote are of a class where they don't need a vocation to support themselves anyways. And then he says like no literary quality can be like acquired by reading writers who display it. If we already possess any such quality as a natural tendency that is potentia, we can, by reading, summon it up in ourselves, become conscious of it, see what can be made of it, be fortified in our inclination, indeed, in the courage to employ it. This then is the only way in which reading can teach writing. It instructs us in the use we can make of our own natural gifts. Thus, it can instruct us only when we possess such gifts. If we do not possess them, we can learn from reading nothing but cold dead mannerism and become superficial imitators. So this, again, falls into that eternal debate between, like, talent and effort. And, yeah, I do believe in talent, but I think effort is also really important. I guess those two do work together as equally necessary. Then the next book, ta-da-da, it's James Joyce, Dubliners. This has literally been on like my to-read list forever. I'm very happy and proud to announce that I finally finished it. So I think the ingenuity of Joyce's writing is that I'm rather impacted. Like, I'm quite impacted by most of the stories here, but it's so difficult to pinpoint precisely why. It's like the characters and events all surround very, very ordinary people. The narrative tone is plain, and oftentimes the plot is rather flat. But many of the stories really just leave me with this feeling that I want to stop for a moment and reflect and just ponder upon them. Perhaps it's because like the quality that's very special in it is the truthful conveyance of very commonplace yet very important emotions and experiences that occupy our lives. So I'm just gonna like bring up a few highlights in this book, that a few stories that really stood out to me. The first one is called Araby. It's like a very short, simple story about a boy's longing to go to a fair called Araby because a girl he admires really wants him to like bring her something. And this simple desire is like repeatedly frustrated by his commitment to like his aunt and uncle. And we see his longing and frustration grow, and we feel this trepidation with him. And eventually he arrives rather late and the fair is like almost finished, and that is pretty much his disappointment. And I think this story is honestly so relatable. It's so typical. It's like when we're a child we have desires, and then adults, they don't think it's a significant thing for us. They repeatedly thwart it with like all the other requirements, commitments. They're just like, oh, it doesn't matter, you can just go another day. But they don't understand like how much those tiny desires like matter to us as kids. Like it just feels like our entire world. And then the next one is called Eveline. So it's a very accurate portrayal of this idea of fear regarding making an impetuous leap in life. So the protagonist Eveline's decision ultimately to stay for the sake of stability, remaining in her comfort zone instead of pursuing a romantic and adventurous way of life. And this is like a decision made after very complex struggles, but depicted in very like subdued writing. And I think it's so powerful and so realistic that people really can't be blamed for staying in what they're comfortable and familiar with. Not everything in life is all about like adventures and like romanticized things. Next one is called A Little Cloud. So it revolves around the protagonist Little Chandler's unfulfillable longing for a life of like poetry, creativity and adventure. So again, this tension. And it's mainly about his conversation with a man called Gallagher, who's living like the sort of reckless free life that he desires. And it really brings out like a Little Chandler's despair and envy when Gallagher tells him about his life. But we also see like there are a lot of mundane duties in Little Chandler's life which really hold him back and resigns him to accept the impossibility of ever living like how Gallagher is living, and it's like could never get out of that imprisonment. So again, very, very realistic. Next one called Counterparts. Like, can I just say how accurate and relatable the story can be for many people? It's basically about a man who's like triggered by so many like small things in his life. It's like when one is in a certain state of mind, literally everything from like work to other people to just walking the street can irritate him. And we all have those moments, and the story is just about these moments in this one man. And sometimes you just realize life just bangs you on the head and everything just doesn't work out. The last one I'm going to mention is A Mother. So it's another very like common case scenario. So parents often have like overwhelming sway over their children's like career prospects or like social prospects, especially at a young age. So it's basically about the story of a mother who, through her narrow-minded views and her greed, basically ruined her daughter's musical career in Dublin because she like tried to ruin the concerts just because they wouldn't pay her enough or pay her on time. But at this entire time, the daughter is shown as like this mute, reluctant, passive figure, just completely at her mother's control. So it was pretty pitiable. So the next book is from the School of Life series, and this is called How to Find Fulfilling Work. Basically, I never read like this kind of books, but there was a reason why I started it, and I actually bought this other book called How to Be Bored alongside with this, and my plan is to finish both of them and then make a video on my like very initial reflections on self-help books. Yeah, because I never read them before. I don't plan to go into too much details, but I will say a few things about it because I'll go into details in the next video after I finish both two books. So in general, I think most of the things stated in here are like pretty straightforward, like obvious. It's kind of like reiterating simple, transparent truths back at me, and there's nothing like particularly enlightening about the stuff it says about work. It's rather overly idealistic in a lot of its advice, playing to kind of like the find your dream job trend, which I think is a bit of a bullcrap, and that's over intoxicating our generation. And yeah, so these are just some of the brief comments. I will have another video coming out where I really analyze these books, so two books together. The last book here is The Rebel by Albert Camus. I've only started like this bit of it, so I definitely won't be making any conclusive comments. I think overall, I just want to say I'm really happy I got this book at a secondhand shop for just like £1. Can you believe it? It's like £1. And I think the opening chapters right now, what I've read is mainly like establishing what the concept of rebellion is, and it's kind of established against the background of the concept of the absurd that Camus has already introduced in his early works. Here are a few excerpts that I thought could help like establish this concept. In every act of rebellion, the man concerned experiences not only a feeling of revulsion at the infringement of his rights, but also a complete and spontaneous loyalty to certain aspects of himself. And then it also says, rebellion, though apparently negative since it creates nothing, is profoundly positive in that it reveals the part of man which must always be defended. So, right, here is a wrap of the books, and I will see you next month.